It was a morning like other mornings, and yet perfect among mornings. John Steinbeck, The Pearl. This is AMI Audiobook Review. I'm your host, Jacob Szymanski. We wanted to make an effort to get more narrators on the show. I mean, it's an audiobook show. How do we not have narrators on more often? We also decided that we also wanted to have more audiobook content creators to be on the show, because these people are opinionated, and when you run a show about audiobooks and you have opinionated people, it's pretty good shine that you're invested. Today we have a prolific audiobook narrator who's also the host of an audiobook show, so two birds, one stone. He's Simon Mattacks, the host of Talking Books. Simon Mattacks is a professional voiceover artist, a narrator based in the United Kingdom, and he's established himself as a prolific audiobook narrator because he has more than 100 audiobook titles to his name. And now he's lending his voice to the show. How's it going, Simon?
Good, thank you. Hello. Yes, welcome. Welcome? No, sorry.
You're the guest this time. You're the guest this time.
Yes, I'm sorry. What am I doing? Who am I? What's my name? Yes, greetings, I should say. Greetings from England. From the home of the king. Yes.
We'll see for how much longer. Political turmoil is pretty all over the place, but that's why we like to immerse ourselves in books that do not exist in reality. At least that's what I like to do. I love reading fantasy, by the way. I don't know what genres you're into, but we'll get to that in a second. Yeah. You're well known for reading quite a bit of Ann Cleeves. Do you want to touch on the other titles that you're well known for that you hear about a lot?
Oh boy. Okay. Yes, I have done some Ann Cleeves. Do you know, I couldn't possibly tell you. I can't remember what they are.
No way.
I know.
They're your most sold books on Amazon.
Are they really?
Yeah.
Okay.
On Audible, I mean.
On Audible. Okay. Yes, I don't know. I've loved her books. I know because they're set up in the northeast of England. Because one of the things that I like to do, he said, as an audiobook narrator is, see, I love accents. And in this country, this marvelous country of ours, we have a lot of accents.
There's so many.
Yeah. And her books are set up in the northeast, in Northumberland, a lot of them, like Newcastle and around there. So I get to do that accent, which I love. And if you're from that area, you're probably going, that doesn't sound anything like a Geordie, Simon. But anyway, that's what I get to do when I do the Ann Cleeves stuff. I've also done quite a lot of fantasy novels, actually, which I find that more difficult because it's a bit like, oh, so and so is a werebear, or they're a kind of goddess nymph who kind of has ice magic, and I'm like, okay, so what sort of voice am I supposed to give that person?
I can hear the incredulity in your voice. Like you kind of need to buy into the book to be able to narrate.
I know. No, I do. Honestly, I do. I love fantasy genres. Of course I do. Why wouldn't I?
It's my favorite genre, but there are tons of videos of me going on about that, about why fantasy is the best genre.
Okay, I'll leave you to that then.
But genuine question though, you're an audiobook narrator. Do you listen to audiobooks in your off time? I asked this specifically because you always wonder if a chef goes back home and cooks for himself, if a janitor is always cleaning his house, right? Do audiobook narrators listen to audiobooks?
I certainly do. Yes. I love audiobooks. I mean, I say I love audiobooks, which is a very general term, but it depends, to be honest. Of course, it depends who I'm listening to. And I have, as you know, there are these little samples you can get on Audible, so you can listen to 5 minutes of the book. And there are times, I have to confess, when I've just gone, no, I'm sorry, I can't listen to 11 hours of this person's voice. And I'm sure there are people who do that with me, and that's absolutely fine, but because it's a very personal thing, isn't it, listening to an audiobook? Especially if you're listening through headphones, it's like the person's inside your head almost. And so you have to kind of like their voice, I think. So I do listen to audiobooks.
Are you ever self-conscious that people are having that same type of judgment on your voice when they're listening to the samples of the books that you narrated?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, I have made the mistake over the years of reading some of the reviews that people put on Audible. And some of them are very, very kind. And some of them are like, I can't listen to this guy. He's terrible. In fact, it was a fantasy genre. I took over this book a series. The previous guy had done about 6 of these fantasy novels, and I took over because he couldn't do it anymore. And it was a very early, I think it was the second novel I'd ever narrated, and I made the mistake of thinking, oh, great, look, I'll look it up on Audible and see what people have written. And they were like, this guy is so bad. He doesn't sound anything like Nate should be. And he was, I don't know why they should be American, but they were very vitriolic and very kind of like, I hate this guy. I'm never listening to another thing he's ever done in his life.
Well, that's such a difficult position to be put in, to jump into book 7 of a series that's had the same narrator from the start.
Exactly.
Did they really expect you to do the exact same voices as everybody else? Even if you did try that, like nobody's going to nail that.
I didn't. The weird thing about it is you don't get any guidance.
Yeah.
So you don't.
Right.
I think people sort of assume that as an audiobook narrator, you get a lot of guidance from the author or from the publisher or from whoever, but actually you don't. So you don't get any content.
You're kidding.
No. So you don't. And in fact, in my podcast, Talking Books with Simon Mattacks, one of the things that I do is have chats with authors whose books I've narrated, and that's quite unusual because actually there's a sort of, it's almost like an unwritten rule that publishers, audiobook publishers and print publishers like to sort of keep authors and audiobook narrators apart. It's I don't know what it is. It's almost like, oh, don't bother the author, just let them sit in a room and write and have their clever ideas, and we don't want them to be bothered by you annoying actors. But most of the authors that I've ever contacted are actually very happy to kind of, to reach out and to have an actor reach out to them and say, because then they can talk about accents and characters and, pronunciations of words, all those things, which is really useful as a narrator.
Right.
Generally, you just get given the book and off you go. And there you go. Off you go.
Presumably the authors would know quite a bit about the context of their book, about the regions that their books are set in, about the, the motivations of their characters, the tone that they had in mind when they were writing it. So why do you think publishers are keeping narrators and authors apart? Is that just a bureaucracy thing? Why is that?
I really don't know. I really genuinely don't know. But it does seem to be quite a thing. I mean, I think it's got better in recent years, judging from some of the authors that I've spoken to, so that now they will, well, in the sense that I think, let's say 10 years ago, authors just said, okay, we're doing your audiobook. Here's Joe. He's going to record your audiobook. Take it or leave it, sort of thing. And so sure enough, Joe would record the audiobook, and that's it. And now they at least get given very often 2 or 3 different samples of narrators. And they get to choose.
Who's they? The author or the publisher?
The author. Yeah, the author will then get two or three choices given to them by by the publisher, I guess, or by the audiobook publisher, I imagine. And then they choose one. And sometimes, obviously, they don't choose me, and I never know about that. But sometimes they choose me, and so, but still, at that point, there is no contact between the audiobook narrator and the author. But of course, now there's social media. Every author is kind of available in a way, and actually a lot of them are very available to their readers. So
you have to be nowadays.
Yeah,
if you want to be a successful if you want to be a successful author, you need to have a social media presence.
Absolutely. And so that means that people like me can find them on Facebook or their website or whatever, and email them, which is what I do sometimes. Not all the time, but sometimes. And I just because it's useful, I think.
Like what? Like what kind of questions have you asked authors of books that you've narrated before?
Well, interestingly, I've just reached out to somebody who hasn't replied to me. I'm right in the middle of doing. I know. Anyway, it's a bit late now because I've just recorded the question I wanted to ask. Anyway, so I'm recording a book called A Death in Berlin by an author called Simon Scarrow, who is a very well-known author, very successful, has written an awful lot of historical novels. And this is a detective series set in Berlin during the Second World War. And it's very good. And it's a sort of, and basically what I was told at the very beginning, not by him, but by the publisher, was don't do German accents for the characters, even though it's all set in Germany. Right. So I'm sort of doing the odd regional accent here and there. But this morning, boys and girls, this morning I had to be the voice of Adolf Hitler, because this detective goes to a party and meets the Führer. And I was just like, okay, so what do I do here? It's like,
You can't not give Adolf Hitler a German accent.
well, exactly. And that's kind of what happened because it actually, in the book, it says that the detective recognizes his voice and recognizes the distinctive Austrian accent, he says, because of course he was from Austria. But anyway, I mean, I'm not saying I differentiated between an Austrian and a German, but I did give him a light German accent in a way that nobody else in any of those novels, and this is the third novel I've done in the series, has a German accent. But I wanted to ask the author about that and say, do you think this is okay? But in the end, anyway, he obviously didn't see his Facebook page, or he decided not to reply to me, and I went ahead and did it. So that's, yeah. So questions like that, I don't know, it's just sometimes very useful.
Well, you'll have to get back on us on if they approve the Hitler-Austrian accent. Because I can't imagine Hitler having your standard British accent.
Exactly.
Well, Cockney.
Exactly. All right, mate. Listen, we're going to invade Poland at the end of the week. What do you reckon? No, that's just not going to happen, is it?
What did it sound like? You want to give us a taste?
It was a light accent. I tried not to go too crazy, not the kind of "We will win the war." I didn't do that.
Okay.
But
light. Okay.
It was kind of like a German, accent, I hope.
Simon, do you have a background in voice acting?
I have a background in acting, or voice acting, or what do you mean? Sorry.
I mean, okay, let me rephrase it this way. Where do you get your skills in doing voices? Just through time? Like, how did you practice? How did you hone your craft?
I spent 4 years in Tibet in a monastery studying. No, I didn't.
That's a lie.
It is a lie. I'm sorry. That's a complete and utter lie, Jacob. No, it's. I mean, I went to drama school and did all that, and I've done some walking and talking acting over the years, but it's been mainly voiceovers. I used to do commercials for years and years and years. And then when they kind of dried up, I gradually got into doing audiobooks about 10 years ago, I suppose. And I love doing audiobooks. But the accent thing, to be honest, it's just something I've always been able to do. When I was a kid, I was 7 or 8, and my family moved from England to Scotland, and I was bullied because I used to go to school and speak like this, and they were all like, "You're a Sassenach," which is, I don't know if you know the word Sassenach, which basically means foreigner. It's sort of like it actually means a Highlander, I think, actually originally. But anyway, it's basically what Scots people call English people, which is sort of you're a not very nice person. And they were like, we've got to get you because you're a Sassenach. And anyway, so I started sort of to try and fit in this kind of desperate way. I used to start to speak like that, and I'd go to school and speak like that with people at school, and then I'd come home and walk through the door and speak like this. And it was then that I sort of thought, oh, okay, this is odd. I can kind of do this. And then, I don't know, it's just something I've sort of always been able to do. I wish I could say I've studied for years and years, but I haven't, I'm afraid.
Well, you learned on the job is what it sounds like.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, I guess so.
I have listened to quite a few of the samples of your books that are available on Audible. And there's a few things that I noticed.
Okay.
One, the main thing is that you read quite fast. And I'd say like significantly faster than the average narrator.
Oh my goodness, that's terrible.
It's not because
isn't it?
Most people speed up the narration speed anyways to 1.2,
really?
1.3.
Okay.
Absolutely. And apparently some narrators read especially slowly, or they don't worry about narrating slowly because they know that people speed it up in the first place. Okay. So you've never noticed that before? Nobody's told you that before?
I haven't. There was somebody once. I mean, again, I really don't read these reviews, but I did. This was back years ago when I was doing it. I did read it, and somebody did say, "Do I speak quickly? Maybe I speak quickly. Do you think I do? Maybe I do. I'm getting paranoid now." So anyway, but somebody did mention that I read quite fast. And it's funny because I make quite a lot of mistakes, and I find that I make more mistakes as I get older. And maybe one of the things I could do is slow down when I read.
Yes, it's something I notice, not specifically from you, but from most narrators, is that narration, anything that's not dialogue will be very slow. And then as soon as you get to lines of dialogue, that's when they start speaking at a normal pace to act it out more than just narrating.
Yes.
Another audiobook narrator that we had on the show a couple of months ago, Julia Whalen. She's really, really good. She told us that for every hour of audiobook that she produces, it takes her about 4 hours of work. Does that sound about right to you?
Wow. I don't mean to diss Julia, but I mean, no, that sounds. No, I normally. I mean, I teach students at drama schools. Have done over the years. British drama schools. I teach students audiobooks, narration, and commercials as well, voiceovers. And I normally say to them, as a rule of thumb, it takes about twice as long. So it would take me 2 hours to do 1 hour. I mean, I don't know if she's editing herself as well.
No, definitely not. She's way too big to edit herself.
Oh, okay. Then I'm sorry. Then I don't know. Maybe she's just, a real perfectionist or something.
How often do you read the book before you sit down and record?
Just once.
Just the one time. Do you annotate? Do you write notes? Create spreadsheets?
Yes,
what's your workflow?
I do. I write little notes. I know some. I mean, again, you see. Look, what can I tell you? I'm a bloke. I'm lazy. I mean, I know the people. I mean, this is a huge generalization, but I know a lot of female narrators who color code everything, and it's all lovely, and they have different colored pens, and it's all marvelous. And I don't, because I'm a bloke, and I just go, he's got a Scottish accent, or he's got a Welsh accent, or he's young, or he's old, or he's gruff, or he's and that's what I do. I would just give the characters some little kind of description, and sometimes I will write out the word a word phonetically if it's a word that's difficult to pronounce or an unusual word. But no, so I just read it once and make notes as I go.
You make notes as you go. Okay, that's what I was going to ask, right? Because surely you have to make notes sometimes. Like you mentioned that you've read fantasy before, and there's a lot of made up words there. So you have to basically figure out the pronunciation.
Yes. So as I read it through the first time, I will make notes as I go on the text. And that's what I do. I mean, for nonfiction, to be honest, I just skim it, and I won't. I would pretty much just sight read that. I mean, you are sight reading it anyway, because no matter how many times you read a book, you don't remember it. It's not like a script. You're not learning it. You are just reading it, sort of for the first time in a way.
In doing this show and talking about how audiobook listeners approach audiobooks, there seems to be two different philosophies. The first is that the narrator of an audiobook is strictly a disembodied voice reciting a book as closely as possible to what the author intended, using context clues and inferring the tone, right? And the other one is that audiobooks are clearly an interpretation of the author's work, and there's creative leeway that the narrator gets, and that's part of the appeal. Do you see narration as being an interpretation of sorts?
That's a very good question, a very interesting question. Yes, to an extent, although I suppose I will try and do what I think the author intended. So I won't kind of go, oh well, the author said this bloke's got a Welsh accent, but I'm going to do him from the West Country because I like to.
Of course,
that.
not.
It's
Yeah,
better.
yeah.
Do you know what I mean? I wouldn't kind of completely ignore something that an author has written. Sometimes you don't get any clues as to sort of accent or physicality of a character, and that can be quite liberating in a way, I suppose, but also quite difficult because obviously it's sort of an infinite choice in a way. But I suppose I do try and do what I imagine the author intended, I guess.
I think if you're trying to basically convey the tone that the author intended in the first place, there's bound to be some discrepancy between what the author intended and what you understood. And from my perspective, that sounds a lot like interpretation. And I'm just thinking out loud here what that might mean, what might be lost in translation. Like, could it be the tone of how a certain sentence was said, right? If there's an exclamation mark after a line of dialogue, is that screamed in anger, or is it excitement, or someone who's perplexed? I still think there's a lot up to interpretation, right?
Yes, it is for sure. And I think, because it's like, somebody, I can't remember who it was now. I read something somewhere. They sort of said that recording an audiobook is a bit like being in a movie where you're playing all the parts, or a play, which is quite a nice idea in a way.
Do you agree?
Yeah, a little bit. Yes, because you are, and you can get very involved in a scene, especially a kind of some of the crime novels that I read. I read a lot of crime novels, but I narrate a lot of crime novels. But and there's a couple of them that have sort of two main a male and a female protagonist, and they're sort of falling in love and having a relationship over the course of kind of fighting crime, if you like. But very often I will get quite involved in that scene, and it's a kind of love scene between a man and a woman, and you end up sort of getting very involved in it, and I kind of love that, and that is, and I suppose that's interpretation of a character, I guess, and it's also an interpretation of a scene, but I do again try and make it pretty much as true as I can to what I imagine the author intended, I think.
What do you mean by involved in the scene? Like personally invested?
Yes. Well, but also
it sounds like you enjoy it.
Yes,
You're just enjoying reading
it. I do. I mean, because also with the main characters of most of these novels, what I always say to my students, and which is what I do myself, is that I try and make the main character's voice my voice. So whether he's a kind of a wizard or whether he's a detective, in the end, or like for instance in this book I'm doing at the moment, he's a detective in Germany, but I mean I'm not doing him with a German accent, and I'm not giving him some sort of accent. He's just my voice. So therefore, when you do that, you sort of you can hear yourself, you can hear your own voice doing this, so you become invested in that character. So yeah, if I'm doing these kind of whatever scene it might be, if it's a scene with the main character, I guess I become invested in it personally.
A lot of listeners of audiobooks, what they're missing out on, and I'm blind, and so like I'm fully aware that I'm missing out on this, is that when you're just reading a book in print, you get to have the character voices in your head, and it's basically your job to do that. The translation of what the author intended the voices to sound like, to be in the reader's mind's eye, if you want to put it that way. Mm-hmm. When you're listening to an audiobook, you're listening to the author's voice. But in a way, like personally, I find after a while, if it's a good narration of an audiobook, it seems like, and I hope you don't take offense to this, that the narrator disappears, and you just the channel of communication between the reader and the listener, it disappears entirely, and it's like the narrator is just a medium for the author.
Well, that's great, actually.
No, I mean, that means you did your job. But it's strange because it's like your art gets kind of buried. Your craft, when it's done well, is silent and underappreciated.
Well, no, because people aren't buying these audiobooks to hear me. I mean, they're buying them to hear the story. They're not. It's not like, I mean, I'm not kind of going to be like, oh, well, so here's a story about my life. It's not. It's a story that an author has written and taken an awful lot of time to write, and so therefore, it's if people are not thinking, oh, that's that guy Simon reading that. They should be listening to the story. I mean, that's what I hope. Yes. So therefore, I mean, and I should just say the thing about the accents is that I love that, but I'm also aware that there are people who just go, oh, for goodness sake, stop doing the accents. Just read it normally, And I'm sorry about that but I sort of, that's not the school of thought that I buy into. I'm afraid I'm like,
It's also your style,
Yeah,
right?
it
It's
is.
probably a big part of why the publishers chose you as opposed to some other guy.
yeah, I hope, I guess. I mean, but yeah. And I certainly, if you like, pride myself on being able to do a number of accents well and not, not horribly. And I've certainly listened to a lot of audiobook narrators who have done accents pretty horribly. So yeah, So I guess if people are not aware of me, and why should they be, then I guess I'm doing the job I set out to do.
You said you listened to quite a few audiobooks. Who's your favorite narrator? And you can't say yourself.
Who's my favorite narrator? Well, I tell you, I can't think of his name now, which is terrible. See, when you get to my age, Jacob, you don't remember anything. But I tell you who I did listen to, who I thought was amazing, was Michelle Obama. I listened to her entire. She did her autobiography, and she narrated it as well. And I was like, for goodness sake, just how many skills can one person have? She was amazing, and she also narrated the book really well too.
Yeah, but that's something we've talked about quite a bit on the show, is that when the author of an autobiography narrates their own autobiography, there's a sense of authenticity there, of ease of telling that story, because it's your own story.
Yeah.
It's like if you were to write your own autobiography.
It's not an easy thing to do either. I mean, I have a friend, just complete name drop, but I produced his audiobook, Rick Astley, who has just produced his book, which is called Never. And I don't know, I think it's just come out in the States. I don't know if I assume it's probably come out at the same time in Canada. But Rick and I are friends. We've played in bands together over the years. And because I do this job, he doesn't. He had to narrate his own audiobook. So I went into a studio and he and I did it, and I produced the book and all of that. And I got an insight into how hard it is actually for somebody who doesn't normally do this job to narrate their own book, and especially because it's their life story. So I mean, I thought he did an amazing job, but it's not easy.
Simon, I think that's all the time we have for today, but I'd love to have you on again, because I still have so many questions I want to ask you.
It would be my pleasure. I
wealth
love
of
this,
knowledge.
So,
Perfect. Yo, we'll have you on again. Absolutely. Let's do it again.
Well, thank you. Enjoy.
Do you
the
want to
rest
plug
of
your podcast?
Day. My podcast is called Talking Books with Simon Mattacks, and if you were to listen to it, you'd probably be the 14th person to have done so. So please do.
That was a perfect plug. Simon, thank you so much for making time. I'll let you get back to narrating audiobooks.
Thank you very much.
Of course. That was Simon Mattacks, a prolific audiobook narrator. And that's all the time we have for today's episode of AMI Audiobook Review. We're on YouTube, wherever you listen to podcasts, as well as on weekends on AMI Audio at 1 p.m. Eastern. And on those 2 weekend days, Saturdays and Sundays, it repeats every 6 hours. I'm Jacob Szymanski. Have a good one.